First of all, I'm from Glasgow, and my accent can get a bit interesting. So even for those of you who have way better English than me, which is probably all of you, so just please put your hand up if I'm not making any sense conceptually, but also enunciatively, okay? I am a professor in literature at the University of Warwick in England, and my job is to be the dry academic, conceptually crazy person for 10 minutes or so. And I'm really just going to talk about the kind of what this thing is. But I'm going to do it by way of interrogation and just questions. You're going to get a lot of those. Because, of course, as we've put up on the website, this is a loose concept and we want to make it one. Yes, we can talk a little bit about the development of the genre. I'm going to say the word for the first time, cli-fi, right? And I'm going to do that. And I want you to think of that whenever I say cli-fi. And then I want to, we can talk a little bit about that, some of the ideas behind it, where it comes from. And then I want to say a little bit about maybe pushing that concept a little bit to see where it might take us with what we know now after maybe the first phase or the generation of cli-fi as an idea and a concept. And I don't want to go on for long. I mean, the idea here is that we don't want to bore you. I'll just say that, right? By talking for too long. We want you to do things. That's always the teacher's get out, right? We want you to do the work. But in a way, if I talk about the concepts and these guys talk about craft and also world building and some of the pedagogical aspects, and it's probably good for us all to try to get involved, right? To start to think about maybe just developing some micro scenes or micro worlds, as it were, with some of the ideas that you'll already have cooking and broiling up within you as to what you might submit for the competition. Okay? Now, having said that, it's a competition, right? So you might not want to share all your ideas with the person next to you and so on and so forth, and that's fine. If that's the case, then by all means do it on your own. But if you want to work with your friend or in groups after we say all what we've got to say, then that's good. And we're going to walk around the room. We're always going to be kind of open to questions and concepts. And we want to hear stuff from you too. You will have, no doubt, have questions about what we say and maybe some ideas about or suggestions as to what you might want to do yourselves with what it is that you want to do with the competition and your entry, okay? So that's kind of the way that we're going to work it. Loose concept, loose workshop, okay? Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about, well, one other thing I should say before we talk about, before I talk about the genre. Maybe it's a good idea just to keep writing down little keywords as we move along. If it's an idea that you've got that pops into your head at any point based on what we say and what you want to write for your submission, then by all means write the keyword down. You can share it with someone else, maybe talk about how to extrapolate it and so on and so forth. If that's the case, then fine. Let's just ask the very basic question, right? What is climate fiction? What is it? I ask the question because we obviously want you to have creative autonomy in what you think it is. You get to determine what climate fiction is. There has been a first wave, we might say. More or less, it maps itself from about the 2000s to the period 2010 as the kind of first wave of what we might understand to be a recognizable thing called cli-fi, right? Or climate fiction. I want us to think about how there is a kind of very young history of a genre and how maybe it's completely fine to administer to that genre, to maybe build on aspects and everything about all the details of what that might be. But it's also fine to kind of push against it, to press against it based on ideas that develop all the time. We're very much in a zone where it's nowhere near mature. There's a problem, however, of course, and it's pressing against us all, right? It's outside right now. And that is that there is an issue about time and pressure. And it's why we have obviously evolved the group itself to think about the relationship, or to think about what we can do in our various different positions and disciplines and silos and so on and so forth with this thing called climate. So what is it that fiction can do? Does it explicitly have to be about climate? That sounds almost kind of heretical to say it. Think about your piece as, in your head conceptually, as maybe arguing the case for being a climate fiction against the grain, perhaps. Maybe you're happy to go with the flow of what that might be. It's entirely up to you. And I want us to push at those different ideas. And I want also for you to think, I'd love to hear those of you who are not going to do the thing that we might call fiction. Maybe some of you are going to do comics, graphic novels, screenplays, design ideas, and so on and so forth. The fictive quality of that will be inevitable because it's oriented towards the future, right? All fiction making, all fictive activity is inherently speculative, even if it's writing about the world right now as I say this thing. It has a sort of sense of anticipatory, or an anticipatory quality. And it has to obviously convince and persuade to some degree that it's a credible world. But what credibility might mean is up to, these guys will say a little bit more about that, I guess, is up to you. And because we're obviously all trying to work out and figure out what exactly this thing called climate means, we have made the idea, we have made the insistence that this thing called climate is not just for the engineers, right? It's not just for, sorry, those of you that are engineers. It's not just for the economists. It's not just for the politicians. Climate is labor, right? Climate is sweat. Climate is work. Climate is fun. Climate is eating. Climate is drinking. Climate is having sex. Climate is playing football. Climate's having a discussion. Climate's about me being able to wear these clothes and so on and so forth. Climate's cultural. It's an inherently cultural issue, and therefore it's an inherently cultural problem and a cultural challenge. How do we relate that, if you like, to the fundamental social issues that have to shift and change, or maybe don't, or crack, or get better, and so on and so forth, through the medium of cultural production? What can writing do? Many people tend to get a little bit idealistic about the fact that maybe fiction making won't make any kind of like, it's a drop in the ocean in terms of its actual effect. Well, if that was the case, why are so many people contributing to this thing so quickly and accreting work in the large and expanding genre which we now know as climate fiction, or Anthropo-Scenes, as we have brilliantly termed it? Well, of course it's about the world to come. It's very much contested because of that, and that gives you a certain amount of creative freedom. That's crucial for us. What do we mean when we mean by future in the world to come? Again, that's up to you to interpret. How you research your work is entirely up to you. Obviously, at some point, there is an issue that many people that you'll be able to find out through hard material ideas about what's predicted, but fiction doesn't always have to deal with what's predicted. It can make speculative leaps in time and space. We're dealing with, of course, as we said, a multifaceted phenomenon, right? The question for us is if we have moved away from the first phase of cli-fi, which really dealt with stories of denial, acceptance, and recognition of the problem. And I'm being idealistic there, I realize that. I mean, there's still very much a place for the drama of denialism, if you like. Then if we've moved away from that, then where do we then subsequently go? We can go where we want. I'm reading a novel right now about genetically modified spiders on a planet 1,000 years from now, terraformed by humans who've left the planet Earth after an ecological collapse and catastrophe. Is that climate fiction? Of course it is, right? Who gets to narrate what climate fiction is? The spiders? Can we have a narrator that's an animal, for example? So where is climate fiction? Who gets to tell the story? Fiction writers have narrated stories through main characters as light bulbs in the past, as foxes, as wolves, as witches, and so on, as ghosts, and so on and so forth. There's a huge amount of creative autonomy. And in that sense, we have to really think through how fiction might change as a, not necessarily as a future-oriented tale, but also as a tale that changes the way that we think about historical tales as tales that we're aware of as cautionary tales of the world to come. What do I mean by that? Let's throw up a cliche. It was a dark and stormy night, right? The classic cliche of how not to write a work of fiction. Again, I bow down to what you guys might say here. Well, in the world of awareness of biophysical collapse, of species, species issues and so on and so forth, of extinction threats, then It Was a Dark and Stormy Night takes on a wholly different hue, doesn't it? It's less of a cliche as such, because we should maybe be anticipating a world to come where a dark and stormy night is exactly the narrative present, right? That's the thing that we should expect to see outside at all times, and that just becomes part of the furniture. So maybe climate fiction actually is just fiction now, right? Maybe we don't need to necessarily put climate in front of it. In fact, maybe the next time you go to the bookshop, you take all the speculative sci-fi stuff out of the specific genre for that, and you put it into the serious fiction stuff, because they tend to get separated out as kind of genres. I don't think necessarily it's a genre, but that doesn't mean to say that you can't slot what your idea is into one. I think it's more of a category exercise. It's a way that we think about how climate itself manifests in our everyday lives and in the everyday lives of the future. They can be as dramatic and as far-flung as you like. It might be 10 years' time, it might be 20 years' time, it might be 30 years' time. But think of this. This is the last thing I want to say, and I'll come back with other points and questions, no doubt. Think of this. If climate fiction in 60 years' time is a world where everything has changed because of the effects of climate change, which may be mitigated, transformed in some way, catastrophic, apocalyptic in others maybe, then it will just be part of everybody's fiction-making life, right? We deal with it as a phenomenon right now, and therefore the argument might just be that if you write a story about someone going to the bus to work every day, then at some point that has a climate-induced element to it. That's the challenge for me, personally, now. Of course, it explicitly has to tell a tale about climate, but what does that mean, about climate? I want us to kind of like really push at the phenomenon in a lot of different, in as many ways as we can. So my job here is to kind of like open up, if you like, the scenario for possible ways to look at it. And I'll stop because that's not almost about 10 minutes, right? So, is it? Yeah, all right, good. Do you have any questions? I mean, should we go for questions just now, or do you want to just go straight on?
I think what would be maybe helpful if anyone has anyone got any specific ideas of things you particularly came here in hope of learning? Is there anything, any sort of burning questions? Just hands up or shout them out, whatever you got. Or are you just generally here to soak up our incredible wisdom? Sweet, let's say what we like then. Brilliant.
Okay.
But as we go along, if you've got a question, stick your hand up, or if we're turned around and talking to something else, just gently knock on the table or something. We don't want this to be a lecture, because lectures are boring, right? You can get those during the day. We do want to try and help you learn how to do whatever it is you want to do. So thank you, Graham. Yep, my name is Paul. I'm a researcher with Lund University now, though I still live in Sheffield in England for reasons which are increasingly less obvious as the days go by. I'm also occasionally, when I get the time, a science fiction writer and critic, and a freelance writer and researcher as well, but that's largely irrelevant to today's exercises. What I'm going to talk about is world building, which is a part of science fiction which, if you spend any time around science fiction culture online or anywhere else, the one thing you'll know about people involved in science fiction is they argue all the time about science fiction. That's kind of part of the course, and frankly, it's also part of the fun. The necessity or otherwise of world building, the how and why you do it, is almost as contested, if not possibly more so, than what the hell is climate fiction. I would say that climate fiction, if it exists, is a subgenre of science fiction. But if you asked me to define what science fiction was, I would run out of the room screaming, because all sorts of people would come after me with pitchforks for whatever I said. So it's very hard to be prescriptive about world building as well. I will try my best to enunciate. Sorry, I'm a terrible mumbler. My mother was always telling me off for that. I will try harder. If I go quiet again, just put that hand up, please. Yeah, so to be prescriptive about world building is kind of challenging, because it's a very vague concept in its own right. But in terms of, I will describe it in the terms that I would use, and if anyone tells you that I'm wrong, they're probably right that I'm wrong, at least in their head anyway. World building is the process of one of the ways of defining science fiction, in contrast to non-science fiction, is that in ordinary fiction, it is assumed that the world in which the action is taking place is the one that you already know, right? All the kind of background rules of how everything works are exactly as you expect them. So in a way, I mean, a lot of science fiction writers say that ordinary fiction writers are actually just lazy because they can't be bothered to make up new rules. You just kind of take all the standard assumptions you know and you go with that. But with world building, with science fiction, you're trying to write, it's a fiction of change. Basically, you're trying to write about the experience of a changed world, a world that is in some way different to the one that the reader is familiar with. So there's an extent to which historical fiction is kind of science fiction in reverse as well. So if you're writing about a changed world, if you could just describe the changes in that world in a quantitative way, but that would be writing an academic paper, right? Fiction is about the human experience, or the experience of a subjectivity, to be looser about it. It doesn't have to be a human, but it has to be something that you can imagine having a subjective experience of whatever it is you're trying to talk about. So if you're talking about change, if you're describing the experience of change, then what you're thinking about is consequences of change, right? Because change doesn't matter if it doesn't affect anyone. There's got to be a consequence to the change. Otherwise, if you couldn't write a science fiction about someone having painted this room red, it just doesn't really make a huge difference, unless I suppose someone has a weird disease and they're allergic to the color red. That could possibly be a thing. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is, don't world build for its own sake, right? It's very tempting, and I do it all the time myself when I'm writing, to you start coming up with ideas and you think, oh yeah, well, we could have that happen, we could have that happen. And you can get very carried away with the ideas. And the ideas are good, and you should always write them all down, because you can always throw them away later. But the important thing is you've got to think about how those changes and consequences are actually affecting, to avoid saying people, let's say agents in that world. So, be they humans, animals, artificial intelligences, whatever it is. There has to be a consequence to the change, or it's not worth telling the story. So to kind of illustrate that point, I'm thinking about the present. So I left, for the students among you, right? My student years were the early 90s. I left home in 1993. And I look around at the world today, particularly the world in England at the moment, and I find myself thinking, well, God, things have changed a lot since I left home, But in some other ways, they haven't really changed that much at all. I mean, certainly not in terms of the things you might see if you were to look, especially in certain places, right? So there are some places, particularly in London, where you can go and you can look, and visually it's very different. If you looked at a picture from 1992 and you think, well, okay, that building wasn't there, so on and so forth. But in terms of, I mean, certainly small towns like the one I grew up in, you go there and things visually haven't really changed very much at all, right? A lot of the changes we've experienced aren't necessarily things you can see, right? So don't always think about the visualness of, don't get trapped in thinking like a filmmaker unless you're making films. But even then, it's worth thinking in terms of experience. You can make a Hollywood blockbuster, but that's not so much about the experience of change as the spectacle of change, and that is a different thing. There's more money in the spectacle of change, frankly, but it's not. There's less art. Let's just say there's less art to it. But so to continue that point, so I think sometimes about my grandmother, who died in 1996, but she was born in 1900. And so for her, especially by the time she passed away, things had really, really changed. And I was saying to Vitska earlier, I can't remember, this is not an original point to me, but I can't remember where I read it first. So, an anonymous citation to wherever it was I caught the idea from. But the point has been made that we talk a lot about the exponential rate of change we've experienced in the last 50 or 60 years, right? It's almost a cliche. People are saying, oh, things have changed so much in the last 60 years. But if you took someone, imagine you had a time machine, you take someone from today back to 1968, and yeah, things would look very different. But most of the things that look different would still be recognizable. You'd still be able to see what they were, and sort of by looking at them, you'd be able to pass what they were about and why they were that way. There would be a kind of logic to it that you would still understand. But if you took someone from 1968 back to 1908, they would be absolutely baffled. And so in that sense, that other 50 years, actually there was more change, but we talk much more about how much change there's been in the most recent 50 years. And in some ways, there was much more change previously. It's not so much that there was more or less, you can't really quantify change, but the nature of the change is quite different, right? It's a change of experience, it's a change of socialization, it's a change of politics and economics. But the material aspects of life haven't changed quite as hugely as we often convince ourselves that they have, right? So, and both of these forms of change are valid, right? It's not wrong to think about one or the other, but the point is not to get too hung up on either one of them. Okay, change is a varied thing, and again, as I said at the start, it's about consequences, right? When you think of lots of ideas, but it's the ones that are consequential to the story you're trying to tell that really matter. Resist the temptation to put everything you come up with in. So another way to think about that is there's a term from manuscript preservation practices. There's a thing called a palimpsest, which is where in the old days when you had a piece of vellum or manuscript, you couldn't, it was expensive stuff. You couldn't just get it like a piece of paper like we can today. So, rather than get a new piece, you'd take an old document and you'd scrape away the ink and you'd write a new one on top of it. And you get this fascinating thing where a lot of medieval documents, you can see the most recent document is written on top of it, but the ghosts of the older documents are sort of visible between the gaps. And cities are a lot like that, and Lund is a great example, right? Because there are buildings here that have been here for literally hundreds and hundreds of years, but there are buildings that have been here 5 or 10 years, and it's all happening in 2018, right? There's a quote which you've probably heard almost certainly, because it gets used on the internet all the time, by a writer called William Gibson, and he famously said in a quote that's often very misused that the future is already here. Sadly, I can't write quite as quickly as I talk. It's already here. It's just unevenly distributed. My writing is terrible as well. That's what typing is for. Okay, so that's a really important point. It gets quoted all the time by futurists. And there's a great picture I have somewhere on my old, now defunct Instagram account of an architectural event I was at, and they'd spray painted this slogan on the wall, but this part of the font was like literally the font was this high, the first half, and this was tiny, tiny writing at the bottom. That's the important bit, right? That's the point Gibson was trying to make, is that the future doesn't happen at the same rate everywhere. In the centre of London, the future is happening really, really fast. In the town where I grew up, it's happening really, really slowly. Frankly, I don't think it's changed since I left, and it hadn't changed much when I had left. So thinking about that uneven distribution of change, you're not going to have the future evenly distributed, right? There are going to be pockets of the past in the future and pockets of the present in the future. Geography, time varies across space, if you want to think of it that way. So another way of putting that, we were just talking to some people from the Roangan, I've probably pronounced that wrong, the Roangan project, which is connected to the church over there. And the priest we used a wonderful phrase, the cathedral is never finished. And the future is like that cathedral. The future is, when you get to the future, it's just the present, right? The future is always a moving target. It's never static, it's not evenly distributed. So, when you're thinking of your imagined future, don't make it finished. It's not a static, it's not an end point. There will always be a future beyond the future you're imagining. And the future you're imagining will not have arrived at all the places that your characters might end up in. Okay? It's not all the same everywhere, is the basic point I'm trying to make. So in terms of what should you show and what should you not, because you've got all these ideas about your changed world. So the famous writer you've probably heard of, a guy called Ernest Hemingway, not a science fiction writer, but he used to use the metaphor of the iceberg for talking about when you're thinking about a story and what you actually put on the page. And Hemingway used to talk about the dignity of an iceberg. If you ever watch film of an iceberg moving through the sea, it's just this huge, stately chunk of ice just drifting through the ocean like that. The point Hemingway made, if this is your iceberg, the thing with an iceberg is only 10% of it is ever above the water. Hemingway's point was the reason that looks like it's moving with such incredible dignity is because you can't see the huge mass of stuff that's keeping its momentum going. When you're writing a story, you need to know all of that in your head. But a good story only ever shows that bit. Okay? This chunk of understanding of how that world works, all the research you'll do, all the notes you'll make, all the ideas you'll come up with, you're only going to show 10%. It'll drive you nuts. Seriously, it'll drive you nuts. It still drives me nuts now. It's one of the reasons I write so few stories. I get so frustrated, but you have to throw those ideas away because story can't carry too much. It's not that it can't carry too much fact, but fact gets in the way of story. Okay, so only let facts in when there's a good reason for the story to allow them in. So there's another rule that any of you who've done a writing course before have probably heard used. You'll often be told, I should always show and not tell. Okay, now that's overly prescriptive, as I was discussing with Bitsker earlier. Sometimes actually there are times when it is quite good to just tell. Sometimes there are points in a story when you want to just move the action on. It's like if a character has to go to the shops to get something, that's not really a plot relevant thing. Just have them, just say they went to the shops and got that. Get on with it. You don't need to show them going to the shops. But in terms of that experience of change I was talking about, that's what you need to show, because that's if climate fiction is about anything, it's about that experience of a changed world, a world that's different to the one that we're currently in, right? That's what you're trying to illustrate. So it's not a hard rule, show, don't tell, but with world building, it's particularly relevant. There's this whole iceberg of change, right? But you just need to show the bit that is relevant. Now, the question of how you decide what is relevant to show is something that Bitsker's going to talk about in a little more detail in just a moment. But in terms of climate change, we all understand, I hope, that climate change is a global thing, right? It's a global systemic issue. But each of us only ever experiences it as a local effect, right? That big thing we call climate change expresses itself in small and very varied ways depending on where you are and when you are and what your circumstances are and what you're trying to do, okay? So, and just to finish on this point and to go back to Graham's Dark and Stormy Night. So there are times when it's really, really worth mentioning that it's a dark and stormy night. But if it's a dark and stormy night every night, that's exactly when you wouldn't mention it, right? Because, and the point being, when a character is narrating something, when a character is telling the story, they're not going to say things that they would consider to be obvious. They're not going to say things that they would consider to be everyday. They're not going to say things that they would assume you'd assume. And if it's a dark and stormy night every night, why would you mention it? It's always dark and stormy. It's just a normal night. And on that note, I'm going to pass over to Bitsker.
If anyone's got any questions at any point, stick your hand up and ask. It may well be that, we'll take some questions after the 3 points. We might have a discussion with each other, but we want to also get you guys to start thinking about how this changes or helps you in some sense think about what your own submission is going to be, what your story world is going to be like. Sorry.
Okay. So I'm gonna do somewhat more practical stuff. I'm also going to tell you something about the craft of writing. First of all, who am I? I am, as Johannes said, a political scientist, but more importantly, this evening, I am also a novelist. I'm from the Netherlands. My books have been translated into a number of languages, and as compared to Paul, whereas Paul was the science fiction writer, I'm of that lazy type of writer who doesn't make up his own world. We could discuss about that, and might even. But before I ask you to listen to more of a story, I'm first going to ask you to write for just a very short period of time. We have heard about a dark and stormy night now for a number of times. It's not really stormy, but most of you came through this dark night. What I want you to do is just, from the top of your head, write down what have you noticed. I give you 2 minutes. And that was the time. What I failed to mention in my introduction was that I do not only write myself, but I also teach novel writing at a Dutch writing craft school. And a big part of my task as a teacher is usually to sort of learn people to disregard all the things that they have been taught to do, such as show, don't tell. I'm not gonna talk too long about that, but why I just ask you to write down what you saw is because, to me, writing is for a very big part about noticing, about seeing, about observing. So we have this word inspiration, and then usually the image of the inspiration of a writer is someone who sits over his desk or her desk and sort of waiting for this magical voice coming along. And etymologically, the root of inspiration is just, well, it is literally the muse breathing into your ear, into your head. But if you think about it, being a good writer is actually about breathing in the world. What happens around you? And especially because, as Paul just said, the future is always unevenly distributed. Looking around you might be the very best step. Looking around you in this present time might be the very first step to actually build up a credible world. Because where can you see here and now this future that is incredibly unevenly distributed? When you fly, for instance, for those of you who do fly, it struck me a couple of months ago that you go into this very high-tech science fiction environment with all the gleamingly white body scanners, and then, well, if you would just see the machinery in a movie, for instance, you'd recognize it immediately. There's the future. That's what I encounter. But when you encounter it in real time, you see all these tourists who might be a bit and very ordinary people, just like yourself. So where, if you start looking very carefully around you, where can you see bits of future? That's a first step. So as just a note of craft, try and keep a notebook wherever you go while you're writing and thinking about the story that you want to write. Because the more of this reality that you might be able to inject into your story, the better it will become, the more credible it will become. There used to be a zoologist at Harvard, and well, Harvard people paid a lot to get into the university. And once they got in, they encountered a table with a fish upon it, slightly stinking already. And they asked the teacher, this famous guy for which they had paid that much money to get into there. And they asked, well, what do we need to do? And he said, look at your fish. And so they looked. And they wrote down a few characteristics. A couple of hours later, because the teacher thought, well, this is workshop, let's disappear. The teacher came back. Students asked again, what do we need to do? Teacher says, look at your fish. Well, you can sort of imagine the rest of this story. looking and then looking better. That is the essential bit, I guess, of being a writer. I don't do that much in terms of the credos like show don't tell. I'm really hate it when people give that as a impression, because always the question is, what do you want to use? What is it that you want to show, and how can you best show it? But one of the things that I try always to keep in mind as a writer is this credo by actually a photographer. And it is, if your pictures aren't good enough, it means that you're not close enough. And that is, I think, particularly important when writing about climate, which you tend to abstract. I mean, Graham just told us, you can write cli-fi and write about making love, having dinner, etc., being all kinds very close to you. But so how do you get close to this abstract theme? I'm very happy to tell you about later on, if people have specific questions about how you build a character, how you write a dialogue. But then I will first need to gather sort of what you would like to learn about the craft of writing. A very interesting story that I suggest you all read, I'm a big fan of it, is The Visit by Stephen Millhauser, and you find it online. And this is a story about a guy who goes to visit a friend who he hasn't seen for a long time. And the friend says, oh, it's very nice that you come and visit me, because I have a new girlfriend, so now you can finally meet her. And he comes to this place, and he meets the girlfriend, and the girlfriend turns out to be a gigantic frog. And you fully believe it. There's nothing weird in this story, because he uses all the emotions that you might expect in encountering the girlfriend of a good friend that you haven't seen for a long time, a girlfriend that you might or might not like, all the really well-known things to build this story, this very strange story, which becomes the ordinary strangeness of everyday life. And if we are talking about these statements about writing, you might have heard about write about what you know, which is sort of a problem when you write about the future. So write about what you know doesn't mean that you need to keep it simple and keep it confined to the things you might have, well, really close connections with. But what you do want to think about is, how can you use the knowledge that you do possess? And knowledge, I mean, in a very broad sense. So the emotions that you have experienced, things like jealousies, things like joy, anger, whatever. How can you infuse those real things in your story? Because whereas you're going to write fiction, and sometimes when I start a course, I tell students, well, writing fiction, writing a novel is actually how to learn to lie, how to learn to tell a long lie very convincingly. But because the style is fictional, because we think it isn't real, we can actually touch upon what really matters. I think we're first going to collect some questions, and then I have an exercise to start some more on the practical bits of world building. And please, if you have questions, specific craft questions, also bring them to the fore.
So do you have questions about anything conceptually, about anything that we've said so far? We hope we're encouraging you to think about the proto project that you might already have in your head, and how it might develop in some sort of shape or form. We want you to interact with other people in the room with regards to that. But we said, we've been through, 30, 40 minutes of throwing things at you. Do you have any questions or points, do you think?
Or disagreements.
Or disagreements, yeah, that's important, yeah. Anyone? Yay, a brave soul at the back. Yeah.
My question to you talk about this airport. Come in and you see the machines and you see the people. And I didn't quite get, like, are you supposed to write about the machines or the people?
No. What I meant was that if you see a science fiction movie, for instance, you always get the very gleaming white machines, and you also get often in movies a particular kind of people. They have already been, they are people of the future. But then when you are at the airport and you have these gleaming white machines that would have been unthinkable quite recently, you have these very modern images, but the people are just us. So we don't recognize what might be seen as futuristic. And when writing fiction, you always, but that we could discuss because there is a very interesting, so what I'm going to say, you always focus on people. That's simultaneously also a criticism on modern novels because they have learned to exclude all the non-human things. And quite recently, you see that a number of, well, science fiction was a much more, they got it a lot sooner, but quite recently you also see it in what is then unjustifiably termed literature as opposed to science fiction. You see that people are starting to think about how can we include a different time frame, or how can we include a perspective of a tree rather than a human narrator. So these are all things that you can experiment with.
Yeah.
I actually have a question about this whole idea of climate fiction being about the future. I think that's a little bit of a limited scope of seeing it as a futuristic thing. A lot of climate change is already happening, and I actually think it would be really interesting to place it with it, just to scope it in a way that it could be happening now or even in history. So what do you think about that? Because we've been talking about the future a lot. Can climate change also, climate fiction also be about what is in the now? Is it then still science fiction? Like, what type of writing skills would you apply differently?
Do you want to answer, or I?
Well, we can all have a go.
We can all have a go,
we
yeah.
can all have a go. Who wants to have a go first?
I would say yes. Let's take a well-known past novel, a novel like Charles Dickens. You're all going, what? 1859, right, or whatever it is. Hard Times. So the novel about industrialization in England, and specifically around a coal strike. Now, the start of that novel is all about the fairy palaces of the gleaming new world that seems to have terraformed itself onto the kind of like rural world of Middle England. And one has a long description of, Dickens has a long description of the landscape, the way that it looks and so on and so forth. It's a twinkling new city. It looks like a fairy palace, he says. And it's also, I think, depending on where you place your starter for the Anthropocene, climate change, right? I mean, it's pumping huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, but it's not necessarily just that one act that accumulates and accretes over time and creates what we might now know and see as anthropogenic change. It's also the human drama of people being forced to the coalface, which is what the novel is about, for their own survival, for their own heat, light, material comforts, such as it may. And that drama, looked at retrospectively from the perspective that we're now looking at in terms of what the future is to come, is futuristic, even though it's set in the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was thinking, I recently read a book about, I think it was called, anyway, it was a book that was based in the past, and it was about a recent discussion about, what is the correct term for it? Like the sense of racism still being a big issue in our current society. And this book was based in the past as well, but it made me really think about like what the consequences of that were for today. So I actually really enjoy the idea of climate fiction also being able to be now. Or
Well, I think the challenge is also how to frame it. I mean, does climate fiction, broadly conceived, have to deal with consequentiality? This is a question I have for Paul about whether or not, to what extent we can figure change and transformation at various scales as part of your narrative or your story. Because what you get in, say, for example, the post-oil novel, so the post-carbon novel, if that's a genre, is sometimes a kind of niche genre called retrofuturism. I don't necessarily mean steampunk or the things that you might know as that. I mean the world that reverts back to an era prior to carbon, for example, or prior to industrialization, because of the disaster that carbon brought on. So the large scale kind of like, let's say, eco-apocalypse of climate change has already happened in the story world out of the novel. And it's a world like the 19th or the 18th century has suddenly reappeared in some way, maybe with occasional figurations of the old world that once was. So there's a great Canadian novel, and I forget the name of it, which is the curse of the lecturer that's my age, where it's an entirely 19th century world in the new Canada, but they dig up old machines that once existed in the 21st and 20th century, and they don't know what they are. They say, what is this? I mean, we know that it's a steam engine or a railway engine or an oil rig, but they don't. So the drama is really about the reader figuring out that that is a world that has lapsed because of climate change, that has resumed to a historical world that we kind of recognize. So there is that. But the last thing I'd say, and I'll let you guys come in, is this question of the fantasy of the present. I mean, the big challenge from quite a lot of climate change critics, literary critics of climate fiction, is this question of whether or not the next 10 years, they're just living right now and writing a story which doesn't see climate change in any way as consequential at any level, might be fantasy fiction. And the realists are actually the people who are anticipating the change world to come. Now, that might be a world in 10 years or 20 years where things are just banally different. I mean, someone might do exactly the same things as recognizably happens, say, right now, except they might go to work in a solar car, or, if we're going to be fantastic, that sort of thing where it's slightly banal, and maybe after 30, 40 years, the drama has changed slight things in the house. Or maybe you want to go for full-scale dramatic shifts, right? It's entirely up to you. I mean, I'm of the opinion that we throw every single form of genre and style and idea at this, as long as we're getting people and readers engaged with the issue of the transformed world that might be to come, in whatever shape or form. Now, that might be too prescriptive for the novelist, but there we are.
It's about as unprescriptive as it can get, really. I'm inclined to agree. Your point is well made, though. I do tend to talk to that future orientation because I'm a science fiction writer and I tend to write about futures, and I work in futurology, which is an awful term, and I wish I didn't have to use it, but I do. Yeah, it's not about the future. I mean, the future doesn't exist to a certain extent anyway. But so every present or past is relative to a previous time to that. Temporality is all relative, right? The whole point of Einstein's work. And so any present, whether your present is now or 2050 or 1850, there was an earlier time, and the people in that time are, for the most part, going to be looking forward to some sort of future of whatever rate. So I guess another way to come at that question is, if it's, so you can write about climate in an eternal present, but you can't write about climate change without there being some sort of temporality going on. And so the future, you might write a short story and that future could be, a week away. It would be hard to talk about, well, I don't know, the way things are going, it might not be hard to talk about significant climate change within the space of a week. These are becoming interesting times. But just, the point being, I mean, the simple answer to your question is sure. You can totally write climate change fiction set in the past. I think actually that's quite an interesting way of approaching it. But that, my get out for having used that, for having used the term the future is, the past was always someone's future. 1977 when I was born was my grandmother's future. It's, you know, the futureness or pastness is, I mean, in fact, that's a really interesting question to ask about your characters and who are, you know, who you're writing from the viewpoint of. How do they, you know, how do they see their temporality? Where do they see themselves in the flow of time? Do they see themselves as having a future at all? And if so, what do they expect or hope from it, if anything? But the point along the line of time at which you make that decision and you make those portrayals is, you can do it whenever. And, you know, I think, you know, as you say, you can retrospectively read historical fiction as climate fiction in a way. It's, you know, the simple answer to your question is yes, you can totally do that. And if you want to do that, you should do that.
I think you have answered so elaborately that I just I won't add further to the yes.
I mean, the question is whether you want, sorry, on you go, please.
Because I really want to give the floor
Sure.
to you, and I believe there were some other questions as well, so.
Any other questions?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, that the technological gadgets are what we often focus on, not only in fiction, but also when policymakers or politicians try to think about, okay, how can change occur? Well, we think about, oh, what can technology offer us? And if you look, for instance, in movies, we are quite, and also if we are looking at the past, fiction writers have been quite well able to sort of predict technological innovations that would be made. But what is much, much, much more difficult is to sort of think about what kind of changes in culture might occur. So if we have lots of science fiction movies where this hyper technological spaceship takes off, but then when you see how the team is made up, it's still primarily white people, and the woman is still quite often someone who has to be saved. So how can we think about the relationships in our changing world? Particularly in relation to energy, you see that in Africa, for instance, lots of things are happening immediately on post-fossil energy rather than making this jump through fossil energy. So how will power balances shift? That's something that you might or might not want to focus on in your story, but it is something that you could think about. How will the world change, and how will everyday relationships change? The car, we never had the car as just a means to go from A to B. There was always a lot of emotion attached to this. You see that very nicely if you look at the early days of car advertising. You literally get commercials with, here we are envying our neighbors with the car, and then we buy the car. Here we are being envied. So what are people going to be envious about? What kind of desires will we have? What will become scarce? These are interesting questions if you want to think about people rather than gadgets.
I think the young lady by the pillar there.
Ask because you were talking a lot about how it's so important to look at the personal character, and also that, for example, characters would always just tell what seems mention worthy to them. And I wanted to ask if, I don't know if that's the right English word, but this all noun narrator, so the narrator who looks from the top and knows everything, if you see that problematic if you talk about the future, or if you find it then hard to connect to this future perspective if you know too much.
Do you want to take it, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole. That's almost. That's the interesting space where science fiction criticism and social science start bleeding into each other. I work with that question a lot in my academic work, actually. I mean, there's the simple answer is yes. I personally think it's quite a problematic way to write, but just because it has problems doesn't mean you can do it and do something interesting with it. One of the ways you could get around that is that classic disembodied third person narrator that seems to see everything if you can make implicit in the story that actually if you can justify the existence of an omniscient narrator, if you can conceive of some agent in that world that might in fact be somehow, here's an idea for free, right? So imagine the stories being narrated by an artificial intelligence that can access every camera and microphone in an entire city. Then so you kind of could have an omniscient narrator. But that example kind of demonstrates why it's problematic, right? It is because that perspective on life is inherently pretty weird and creepy and surveillance-y. So I mean, it's an interesting question, the question of who narrates and how they narrate, who gets to speak and who doesn't, who is seen, who is not seen. These are very sort of classic postmodernist criticism questions from the 90s, but those are I think, vital questions now, for exactly the reasons Vicka has just mentioned. It's, that's, if anything, I feel that those, as I said earlier, it hasn't really changed that much since the 90s. What has changed is our attitudes to that sort of stuff. Not enough yet, I think, but those, that sort of narrator was much more popular then and is less so now. And I think because we realise that, there's something strange about just conceiving of anyone having the power to observe the world in that way and the illusion of objectivity that it provides. I mean, that's a very sociological answer to a pragmatic question. I'd say it can be easy to write that sort of story, but I don't think it's easy to write a good story that way, or at least not one that's going to work for a modern audience. But
if I can just react,
please.
Because one of the great things of fiction is that you can do things that aren't necessarily fully logical, as long as they are logical within the terms of your world. So if you look back at the past, if you look at the books of Virginia Woolf, I'm not sure if you would call that an omniscient narrator, but she uses fragments from within the heads of different people. So you can have one moment within a city, people are looking at an airplane that is coming over, and you get different glimpses from the woman who walks there is going out to get flowers, from a veteran soldier. So whereas there wouldn't be an all-knowing narrator in the sense as little did she know that you might get very different glimpses from different heads, different perspectives, and that things like that you could easily do, because this was also a time in which people struggled with where are we going? What is the kind of knowledge that we have? And I think that one of the great things of fiction is that you can sort of implicitly ask that question, what kind of knowledge can we trust? What do we know and what do we not know? And climate change itself has been described sometimes as a ghostly phenomenon. So what if you would write about climate change in the shape of a ghost story?
One of the interesting things I think that the science fiction, the African-American science fiction writer Samuel Delany, one of the greats of SF, says, which I always tell my students, is the interesting thing about SF is the literalization of that which almost seems the inconceivable, right? So you can have someone, for example, in a conventional novel saying, metaphorically, she had the whole world in her hands, right? So in an SF novel or a fantasy novel, they literally have the whole world. They can have a whole world in their hands, right? And if you think about the kind of cognitive shift between the possibilities of one and the other, we get into interesting terrain. I also think I would make a shout for not just for narration, but also, you mentioned it, focalization. It's important to think about who sees the world and from what position you are being told about that world, as much as the way and the tone in which they say it and so on and so forth. But also, time shifts are going to be interesting for us. I mean, that is the great, it's the great challenge of writing about a world that might be to come, that's speculative. I mean, do you write in different time frames, for example? Do you write two separate narratives altogether that might even seem completely dissonant from each other? I mean, and at some point the reader has to make the connection between the world that once was and the world that was 60, 70, 80 years ahead of it. Quite a lot of it works that way. Or is it completely presentist? I mean, a novel like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, for example, where you are not told at all what happened. One can only speculate, but one has to follow the characters very closely to see how they react to this world that they're having to subsequently navigate. We could think about one last one is to do with the iceberg, is a Scottish novel, which is parochial of me, I'm sorry. A recent one called The Sunlight Pilgrims by Jenny Fagan, which is set in the far north of Scotland during a big freeze. And the reason I'm saying this is because it brings up questions of time and speed and control of time and space, which climate fiction at some point, I think, or any kind of like representation of changing climate has to deal with in a way that might be slightly different from conventional fiction. There's a gigantic iceberg that's floating from Norway towards the northeast coast of Scotland, and everyone goes and has a look at it as if it's a spectacular phenomenon. It's incredible, but it becomes enormously mundanely absorbed into the world of the characters. They're not necessarily interested in the gigantic thing that's floating in front of them. We're actually more interested in how they look at it and then subsequently think, how do we gather wood for the fire tonight? And the human drama between the different characters about how the gathering of firewood takes place is actually the duration of the narrative. But you've got the gigantic thing in the back of your head when you're reading it, because that's the unconventional thing that's happened. And they treat it entirely mundanely. Well, it's a gigantic freeze. It was always going to happen. It's a spectacular thing to look at, but we better get on with having to deal and navigate with this changed world. Now, if you're doing a graphic novel, you can do 3 different depictions of that in The Gutter Does All the Work for You in the graphic novel. Just 1, 2, 3. That's changed. It's the iceberg in the background, but the characters in the front. Maybe you want to switch it around in a lot of different ways. One of the representative difficulties of climate change is this question of slow and fast pace, right? Rob Nixon's famous book on it is called Slow Violence. One of the problems he said in trying to represent this thing is the fact that it's accretive. It happens over maybe 50, 60, 70, 80 years. So for politicians, that's quite a difficult thing to kind of, who live in short-term cycles, that's difficult to somehow represent. For those of you who can bend time and space diachronically, that's great. That's much easier, right? And it's geographically uneven as well. So you might think of M.A. Taranta's novel Water, what's it called? The Finnish novelist, I forgot the name of it again. Memory of Water. I mean, it's set in future Finland, but it's really China, because the water wars have, and we're not told this for a long, long, long time. We think, why is the whole drama about tea making? Where is that ritual came about? And this is the new changed social relations that exist in that world. So, and a lot of that's just completely left off stage, right? I'm going to stop.
Yeah, because I want to ask you
Good.
to write a scene, actually, because you've been listening quite a long time. And what I want to ask you is to describe a birthday party. And that might be as cozy or not cozy as you want your birthday to write about. Of course, the not cozy is mostly easier to write about than the very happy-go-lucky. But just whatever you want. And two questions that I want to give you to think about is how do people think, the people that are gathered at this birthday, how do they think about foreigners? Whichever meaning or connotation they might give to that word. And the other question that I want to ask you is what kind of food that is available in that world is never ever eaten? So, good luck.
I propose that we run and heat and light the building on all the creative energy in that last 10 minutes, right? So that was 10 minutes, and we hope it's productive. Obviously, fiction and world building can take a lot longer. Maybe not. It's up to you. Everyone goes at a different pace. maybe do we have a volunteer that might want to read what they've just done back to us? Anyone? It would be good if we did. No one is going to criticize you. Anyone willing to just tell us a little bit about the world that they build, or how maybe they found that problematic in some way, or how it opened up different ideas for you? Is it good practice? Anyone? Thank you.
Yeah. So I've been thinking of sort of the same world I've constructed for several years really. So I just normally go there, and it was an interesting task. So I don't really want to read it because I just read it, but
That's okay.
It's about a kid called Jorge, who's turning 19, and his grandpa gives him a USB stick with music from his time to sort of pass something on, to give him some from our times, what we would consider modern music today, or sort of some esoteric stuff from today, perhaps, to describe the world he grew up in and the world he went out and danced in and so on, and how Jorge's mother, who is also at this birthday party, is perhaps not so excited about his grandfather's insistence on giving him strange music from his time and encouraging him to go out and partying instead of studying, and like maybe he should, to have a chance at getting into some schools he should be perhaps already been attending. So yeah, that's what I wrote about, and there was some interesting constraints about foreigners and food. So I sort of wrote about how the grandfather says something about the mother wants to send him to Russia, and how the grandfather is not so happy about this because Russia in his time was a very different country and place. That would be our time. And as for food, I don't know, insect burgers, trope, I guess.
Cool.
Where the mother says that there's no. The grandfather says that insects are bird food, and the mother says, thankfully you killed all the birds, so we can eat insects.
Change of perspective there, yeah.
As I'm organizing and can't enter, I'll just freely share with you.
Yeah.
I completely forgot it was supposed to be a birthday. There's nothing about birthdays in the story. But in my head, there's been this North Korea-like colony of people who still eat meat. So the rest of the world, it was banned. But they persisted, they created this little thing. And when this story is set, it has just opened up. So people have started to leave, but they are regarded with suspicion by the rest of the society. And this is set in the southern South, or in the US South. And so the main character has invited this person over for dinner that's from this colony. And that's what he said. And he has then brought a chicken from the colony and proceeds to butcher it in her kitchen to everyone's dismay.
Cool. Just as I was the craft person here, just as a little trick, we have been speaking about focalization, which is a technical term, so whose voice are you hearing? But actually hearing a voice is also really, really helpful if you're writing. So now we've had the content of the stories, and of course we're with a big group and unknown, and it's a contest. But if you are writing for yourself, don't forget to read your story aloud, because storytelling, it used to be all spoken word back in the past, and still, if you would stumble over your own words, then you notice that there's probably something amiss in your text. So that's just a note on form. So it really helps you to read aloud. If I'm writing, I'm always mumbling, and yeah, so cool examples.
Because they're about, I mean, immediately I'm thinking, okay, generational conflict on a geopolitical level, right? About consumption, and also about the device, which is the historical recording device between two different possible eras. So we're shifting in times through one specific focus on a device. Can I ask you, Vitska, what's the purpose of the exercise in terms of the constraint? It's really, it's good. It's a kind of, you know, generational thing, generative thing.
Generative thing. Yeah, well, in general, I think your creativity is much helped by the idea of constraints, because there's sort of the idea of being creative as if we can do everything we want. But if we can do everything you want, then you have just this empty white computer screen or empty white page staring back at you. And also, these, as I just said, I think it's really important and interesting to think about how our culture might change. And the tricky thing about culture is that it is there in things that you don't recognize. I mean, it's literally the water in which we swim, so we never notice it. But then, if there is a very mundane conversation on a birthday, and if people have topics, I mean, every people in every time of the world has a relationship to food, and it has a relationship as to who are we. The question, who are we and who are the others, is one of the most recurring questions through history, probably. So how to use that kind of daily, in this case, well, the routine of a birthday. And of course, if you want to sort of map out your timeline for your story, you could also, so if you're not sure how has this world come about, if you want to think about the iceberg and the part that is underneath the water, you could also for yourself try and sketch a number of birthdays. And how has this world changed if we... So that might be a very interesting perspective to start at the individual level. And it's these everyday routines, I mean, that really shape our lives. Of course, there are all kinds of big and very important events on the world scale of politics, but that is not what you remember. What you remember is, well, a birthday party, or when you meet someone. So these unnoticed moments, I think it's very important for novelists to make that visible. Yeah. Well, that is a question to think about. Yeah. Perhaps they might have a different celebration. It's not for me to answer. That's a question that I immediately can throw back to you.
I mean, birthdays are about time and reproduction but it's also about transformation, right? But it's also fundamentally a ritual. So will rituals exist in a climate change world? What type of rituals will exist? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that might be a question in your society, in your world. Yeah.
Yep, there's one there.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just speak up a little bit, a tiny bit?
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
And of course, reduced population being a kind of macro question about the transformed world. I mean, there's a long tradition of fiction, as I'm sure you know, well, we used to call it the last man fiction, but that's probably problematic. I mean, last people fiction, or one thinks of P.D. James' Children of Men novel, where people suddenly stop being able to conceive, and the whole world transforms because of that, and the fiction itself slows down. Because there's literally not going to be a human future. There'll be a natural one. Yeah.
The just to add, the movie about that is terrific
Yeah,
as well, because it
Coron.
really shows these puppets, especially when he's in a metro and you see glimpses of this world. It's really might be a really good one to get inspired by. There was a question.
Someone?
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Was that a finger or no? Okay, so maybe just as a slightly more technical reminder, there is it has been said that there are very limited number of plots in all of literature, that you could summarize all of literature in, what is it, 6 or 8 plots. And then if you look in terms of conflict, because the conflict, or there needs to be some kind of confrontation in your story, or needs is again a difficult word. In most stories there is this kind of turning point, a change, which is often brought about by conflict. It's what keeps you reading on. And these kinds of conflicts that can be either between two human people, like in love that goes wrong, or in like one person against society, where people get crushed, for instance, under difficult labor systems, man against nature, or a conflict within man. So that might also be a question to ask yourself, what kind of conflict am I dealing here with? And if you, because the contest is in various categories, if you want to write about travel, about the urban, about the rural, how does that connect to the conflict with your characters?
I'm gonna sweep in now.
Yep.
Stop you, otherwise you'll talk all night. So we have roughly 15 minutes left, but I wanted to leave that time to, if you wanted to ask questions that are not for the entire room, but maybe more to one of these, and also to talk to each other and exchange ideas. So I've sent an email to everyone that signed up with the link to the Slack channel. If you haven't used Slack before, just ask me and I can give you an introduction. So please join the Slack, and we will share interesting links and interesting works of fiction we come upon, and also updates as the competition goes along. And I'm just really happy that you all showed up here. I hope you learned a lot. I know it's quite late and everybody has had a long day before, but I got really excited listening to you, and especially listening to what you have come up with already in these 2 exercises. So thank you. Mingle, you can still be here for a little while if you want. Ask questions. And can we please give a round of applause to the